Hey everyone, hope you're doing well today. Today is going to be a Zephyr 101 tidbit on not having any main function in your code. Interesting, right? All right, well, let's jump in and go into the details. Yes, it is completely possible to write an application in Zephyr without ever creating a main function. The main way you can kind of do this is utilizing Zephyr's sysinit function. It's actually a macro, and what it'll do is it'll call a callback to initialize whatever you need to do during boot. But we can also use it for our own purposes. A lot of code in Zephyr that uses this macro is actually for drivers and things like that, but we can totally take advantage of it as well. Then you can run your own custom threads or work queues or anything else that you'd like to do, or the system work queue if you don't want to branch out and create your own. So there's a lot of options for you, and we'll go into the details right now. In this case, we'll be talking about a sensor application. I actually modified the accelerometer ZBus sample from the last video. If you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely check it out. But we'll be diving into it a little bit here. So what I've done here is I'm initializing sensors using the sysinit macro. And one thing you can see here is that the init function does give you an argument of a device. In this case, there's no device here to be used, so you just want to make sure that we wrap that guy in the arg unused macro. If you are running if you're running compiler with warnings or anything like that, it will probably barf at you. By default, it doesn't, but it's always good practice to kind of do that so keep things sane. But if you look down at the sysinit macro, you see the name of that function, which is the same as the callback up there. The levels, so there are multiple different levels. There's kind of pre, post kernel. The one that you would most likely want to use is the application level. And finally, priority. This is pretty important here. The priority, the lower the number, the higher the priority, which is kind of, it could be unintuitive for you if you haven't been around this stuff for very long. So this actually indicates 90 is going to be one of the last things that gets run before the rest of your application gets run. So keep that in mind. So sysinit, you can use it to initialize each of your modules. Just make, the thing here, the biggest takeaway, if you choose to do this, is just to make sure that you're setting the priorities correctly, setting them so they're in the correct order, so when you boot, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Then depending on your code, you can use ZBus to share events between different modules, or you can use you can use message queues to store larger amounts of events. I say and or because message queues can stand alone and they can be just on their own, or you can use ZBus to kind of, if you're sending multiple messages to multiple different modules, then you can use the message queue on the receiving module to actually kind of store those events and then process them and do something with them later. And then on the end is any type of thread that you set up for the processing threads for getting sensor values or encoding or publishing. These are the things that you're going to set up on a kind of per module basis. I like actually setting up processing threads for things like getting sensor values in particular, because then that one thread owns a particular bus, which is really helpful and makes your code a little bit more sane in terms of you don't want multiple different areas of your code accessing something like an I2C bus or a SPI or anything like that. So it's just keeps things a little bit more sane. And also the ultimate goal here is making it so your code is kind of put into buckets. The functionality is set in one file, another set of functionalities in another, so it kind of organizes a little bit better rather than having some crazy monolithic main file. So here's another init function that is also used alongside the other one, but in this case I've set the higher priority, so this is going to be executed probably last before init is done with setting up Zephyr essentially. And all we're doing is starting a sampling timer, a 1-second timer, and that timer actually uses ZBus to send or push a message over to the sensor main loop, and the main loop will continue, will get a sensor, will actually do a poll, and will pull the sensors and get the values. And this will happen over and over and over again. But all we're doing is kicking off the timer. All we need is a small function to kick off the timer, and that's it. We're done. So, but the biggest thing here is making sure that that priority is correct. So if we set this priority lower than the previous one, so if we set it lower than this, it would actually set the timer off before the sensors were initialized, and it could cause problems in your application. You might get errors saying, hey, this is not initialized properly, or it's not ready, or whatever. So something to keep in mind. So before sysinit was used, I guess you could say, if you look into Zephyr right now, you can see sysinit is used across drivers to initialize the drivers before your application even boots. So that's kind of like the original idea of how it works or why it exists. But you can obviously take advantage of it yourself, and make sure that the biggest caveat, the biggest thing that I'm trying to hammer down here is just make sure that you get the priority correct, because you'll run into problems during initialization and boot of your application. So that's probably the biggest caveat, and that's really literally, this is like, if you have your main function, you're doing a bunch of setup, it's just setting the order of when those calls are happening. It's just a number rather than putting the call in your main function and saying init sensors, init cloud, init blah. The numbers are essentially doing the same thing. That's the biggest takeaway here. See the updated accelerometer ZBus sample. I removed the main function completely, and it's the same functionality. It uses ZBus and it doesn't have a main function. So I put that link in the description below. If you haven't seen my video on ZBus, that is also in the description box below. So check them out. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your feedback. And that is it for today. If you like this quick tidbit, hit the like button, hit that bell icon, and of course, subscribe. I really appreciate it. So we'll see you on the next one. And until then, I love to hear from you. Please leave a comment, and we'll see you in the next one.